I thought I knew these woods. I'd been coming to this ridge for years, hiking the same trails, setting up camp in the same clearings near the stream that cut through the pines like a ribbon of silver. Every spring and summer, I'd come for solitude, for the quiet I could only find up here, away from the hum of town and the constant flicker of screens. But that night, as I followed the familiar trail up the slope, something felt off. The air was heavier than usual, thick with humidity, and the smell of damp earth and pine needles was almost suffocating. My boots sank a little deeper into the soft ground with each step, and the usual chorus of insects and frogs was muted, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed against my ears. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the forest settling into the late hour, but the unease didn't leave. I reached my usual clearing by the stream just as the moon rose high enough to filter through the branches, pale and ghostly. I set up my tent, fumbling with the poles, my hands shaking more than they normally would. I told myself I was just tired from the hike, that my imagination was playing tricks on me. I made a small fire, the flames crackling faintly, casting flickering shadows across the pines, and I sat there staring into it, trying to remember why I loved this place so much. That's when I first heard it, a faint whisper, almost like someone was speaking just behind my ear. I froze, listening, thinking the wind had caught in the trees, or maybe a bird or owl was calling. But the sound didn't move like the wind. It stayed constant, hovering beneath the canopy, circling me in ways that made no sense. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I sat cross-legged by the fire, telling myself I'd imagined it. But the whispers didn't fade. They grew just slightly, soft words threading together into sounds that were almost intelligible. I didn't want to believe it, but I thought I heard my name. A soft, urgent call, almost pleading. "Daniel." I jerked upright, scanning the shadows beyond the firelight, but there was nothing. Just pines bending gently in the slight breeze, and the stream glinting silver. My heart raced, every muscle tight with a mix of fear and disbelief. I told myself I needed sleep, that the whispers were my mind playing tricks after a long day, that I was alone and safe. I zipped up my tent and crawled inside, trying to block out the sounds. That's when it became worse. The whispers didn't stop at the tent. They seemed to press against it, circling, curling around the fabric like smoke. I could hear words now, small phrases, sometimes frantic, sometimes angry, always my name. I tried to leave, unzipping the flap and stepping into the cold night, flashlights sweeping across the trees. Every step I took, the whispers seemed to surge, sharper, louder, almost pushing me back toward the tent. It was as if the ridge itself was alive and didn't want me to leave. My legs trembled, my breaths coming in short gasps as I backed into the safety of the tent. I didn't sleep that night, sitting upright, listening to the voices as the hours dragged on, each whisper a thread tightening around my chest. Dawn came slowly, a pale wash of gray through the pine needles. The fire had died to embers, and the world seemed to exhale around me. I packed quickly, hands shaking, avoiding the stream, avoiding the shadows where the whispers had been strongest. I didn't look back as I scrambled down the trail, branches catching at my jacket, roots tripping me. Even as I reached the lower ridge, the voices lingered, soft, echoing through the stillness of the morning. I tried to tell myself it was over, that the mountain had only played tricks on me in the dark, but I could still hear faint murmurs riding the wind through the trees. Back in town, I tried to bury the memory, but it lingered. At night, when the wind picks up, I hear it again. A soft whisper threaded through the rustling leaves outside my window, calling my name, reminding me that I am remembered. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a deer, maybe a neighbor fooling around, but the words were human, too deliberate, too urgent. The sound of them pressing against the night is a weight I can't shake. I still go back to the mountain sometimes, but I avoid that ridge. I can't tell anyone exactly why. The words sound ridiculous when spoken aloud. And yet, even weeks later, I catch myself pausing mid-step, listening for a faint whisper behind me, wondering if the pines are moving in a way they shouldn't, waiting for me to return. It wasn't just the voices. It was the way the woods felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. The shifting shadows, the slight bend of the trees as if leaning toward me, the soft but deliberate snapping of twigs underfoot when no one was there. I told myself I was paranoid, that it was isolation, the quiet of the mountains amplifying every sound until it became a symphony of imagined dread. But no matter how far I went, no matter how much time passed, the memory of that night remained. I could feel it in my chest, in the way the air seemed to close around me on a calm evening, in the lingering echo of a voice that was too human to ignore. I don't know what it was that called me that night. Maybe it was someone or something marking me, reminding me that even when the forest seems empty, it remembers every footstep, every whisper, every soul that dares to tread too deep. I haven't returned to that ridge in full, and I don't plan to. Yet, even now, when I close my eyes, I hear it faintly over the wind, just behind me, like a memory or a warning. The woods haven't forgotten, and I don't think I ever will. Even typing these words, the hair on my arms stands on end. It's the quietest things that scare you, the almost imperceptible shift in the air, the whisper that seems too close, the feeling that you're being watched when no one is there. The ridge is still out there waiting, and somewhere in the pines I can hear them, my name carried over the wind, pressing insistently, reminding me I am remembered, that the forest is patient, and that the night doesn't end when the sun rises. The memory has settled into me like a shadow I can't shake. I don't walk the same trails anymore. I avoid the quiet clearings near streams. But even here in the heart of town, when the wind rustles the trees or a soft voice seems to linger just beyond hearing, I feel it again, the weight of the whispers beneath the pines, calling, circling, persistent, and utterly alive. I had been paddling alone along a narrow river deep in the backwoods, the kind of place where the trees lean so close over the water that you feel as though the sky itself has been swallowed. The day had been bright, sun cutting through the canopy in fragmented streaks, and I thought it would be a simple evening trip, nothing more than a quiet drift through familiar waters. The river was narrow here, winding in unpredictable loops, and the banks were thick with underbrush that scraped at my kayak when I got too close. I liked the solitude. There was a certain rhythm to the paddle strokes, a calm that settled into your bones. But as dusk crept across the sky, washing the world in gray and shadow, the calm began to crack. I first noticed it on the far bank, a dark figure that didn't quite belong. At first, I thought it was just a tree stump, one of those oddly shaped roots that grow like twisted fingers into the river. But as I drew closer, I realized it was moving. It didn't step or walk in any way I recognized. It glided almost, sliding along the bank like a shadow that had lifted from the forest floor. I froze mid-stroke, letting the paddle drift in the water, eyes locked on it. The figure didn't respond to my calls. I shouted, waved my arms, tried to signal, but it stayed just at the edge of the trees, silent, unmoving in a way that made my stomach sink. It seemed tethered to my presence, pacing me as I paddled down the river, always at the periphery of vision, never fully revealing itself. Night fell faster than I expected, the kind of dark that swallows the banks and makes the water an endless black mirror. I glanced behind me, and there it was again, still gliding alongside the river. Something about the way it moved, all smooth and deliberate, made me uneasy. My heart raced as I realized I hadn't passed a single campsite, not a single cabin, not even the faintest sign of human presence in hours. The forest pressed in on both sides, the shadows of trees stretching into the river as if to trap me. I told myself I was imagining it, that the low light and fatigue were playing tricks, but the figure didn't disappear when I blinked or adjusted my eyes. It was there, patient and silent, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I rounded a bend and my chest tightened. More figures had appeared now, lined along the bank like statues. I didn't stop to count, but I could feel them watching me, the water between us echoing with their stillness. They didn't move, didn't shift, and I didn't dare get closer to examine. My instincts screamed to turn back, but the river behind me had become unfamiliar, winding in ways I didn't recognize. Panic set in, a creeping, slow dread that made my muscles lock. I searched for a place to pull ashore, a spot to camp safely, and every shadow seemed alive with movement. My eyes darted along the bank, catching glimpses of branches snapping, leaves rustling without wind. All the while the figures remained just out of reach, tethered to me in some way I couldn't understand. Finally, I found a small clearing off the river, the mud firm enough to set the kayak down. I dragged it out, heart hammering, ears straining for any sound beyond my own breathing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, as if unseen footsteps were brushing the water just beyond the bank. I tried to make a fire to chase away the shadows with its light, but even the flickering flames couldn't push back the sense of being watched. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the sounds of the forest were distorted, amplified into whispers and echoes I couldn't place. I wrapped myself in my blanket, sitting close to the fire, but I didn't sleep. Every minute dragged like an hour, and I kept expecting movement in the trees, eyes on me in the dark. Morning came in a haze, gray and uninviting. The river glinted faintly, but the figures were gone, or maybe I just couldn't see them in the daylight. I didn't linger. I packed the kayak in silence, not daring to make a sound, and launched myself back into the water. The river twisted and turned, familiar yet foreign, and I kept my eyes scanning the banks, half expecting the shadows to reappear. They didn't. The forest seemed normal again, birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze, but the memory of those gliding figures pressed against me, heavy and unshakable. I kept moving, paddling faster than I had that morning, until the river finally led me back to trails I recognized. Even then, I could feel the presence lingering, patient and unseen, as if it had followed me just out of reach, waiting for the next time I dared to enter its domain. Weeks later, I still feel it. When the wind shifts just right, or the moon casts its light unevenly through the trees, I swear I can see them again. Shadows gliding silently along the edge of vision, tethered to me, patient, waiting. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was exhaustion, or low light, or imagination. But the memory doesn't lie. There's something out there in those rivers and forests, something that watches and waits, and it remembers everyone who dares to wander too far. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can see the bend in the river, the dark water moving beneath the trees, and I feel the pull of those shadows, silent, patient, tethered. I don't think I'll ever truly forget them. I had taken a trail that I'd never used before, a narrow ribbon of dirt cutting into the forest, convinced that it would be peaceful, that I could escape the crowds and the noise of the more popular paths. At first, it was exactly what I expected. The kind of trail that smelled of wet leaves and pine, where birds flitted above the canopy and the wind whispered softly through the branches. I felt a sense of relief settling into my chest, a rare quiet I hadn't felt in months. The path wound gently upward, flanked by mossy roots and thick underbrush, and I moved at an easy pace, thinking I would find a clearing or a stream soon, maybe even a small ridge to stop and rest. But as the minutes turned into an hour, the trail began to change. The forest felt heavier, the canopy darker and closer, pressing down around me. Branches snagged my sleeves and scratched at my arms as if the woods themselves were reluctant to let me pass. The undergrowth thickened unnaturally, gripping at my legs and boots, slowing my pace. I stopped, breath ragged, and looked around for a marker, a tree carved with an arrow or a painted blaze, but there was nothing. No sign of the trail continuing. My stomach dropped. I turned back, expecting to see the familiar dirt path I had walked, the way the forest opened behind me in soft patterns I recognized, but it wasn't there. The trail had vanished, replaced by a maze of twisted roots, thick brush, and dark shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Panic began to settle in, a slow, creeping weight that made my chest tight. I retraced my steps, trying to remember the exact turns I had taken, but the forest had changed. Every direction seemed wrong, every tree unfamiliar. With each cautious step, I heard branches snapping behind me, faint but deliberate, though I was entirely alone. The sound made my heart jump, and I quickened my pace, but the path seemed to fold back on itself. I passed the same moss-covered rock 3 times, each glance confirming that I had not imagined it. It felt impossible, like the forest was a living thing, rearranging itself around me, keeping me trapped in some silent loop. By the time night fell, a low humming had begun to seep through the woods. At first, I thought it was the wind through the trees, but the sound was too constant, too measured, almost alive. It vibrated in the air, a deep resonance that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I kept moving, eyes straining through the darkness, flashlight beam cutting jagged lines through the dense foliage. Shadows twisted along the path, fleeting and impossible to track, always just beyond reach. Every step felt heavier than the last, exhaustion gnawing at my legs and lungs, but the humming persisted, pressing against me from all sides, as if the forest itself were aware of my struggle. I stumbled and fell more than once, caught in roots and thickets, until I collapsed completely, shivering in the cold night air. The darkness pressed close, and the sound of the low, vibrating hum surrounded me, almost comforting in its consistency, yet deeply unsettling. I stayed there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to think, the forest alive around me with sounds that were wrong, too deliberate, too patient. The thought that I might not find the path again made my chest ache in a way I couldn't describe, a hollow weight that seemed to fill the whole of me. When morning finally arrived, pale and gray through the trees, I staggered to my feet and moved forward with desperate care. The forest seemed slightly different in daylight, the shadows retreating, the trees more solid and familiar. Eventually, I stumbled onto a path I recognized, one I had used before, and relief nearly knocked me to the ground. But even as the daylight warmed my shoulders and I breathed in the fresh mountain air, the sensation of being watched lingered. Every rustle of leaves, every movement in the underbrush made me pause. It was as if the trail had never truly let me leave, as if the forest itself had marked me, kept me in its memory. Even weeks later, the memory clings. I can't walk in those woods the same way anymore. I avoid trails that are too narrow, too isolated, because I remember the weight of that humming, the way the branches seemed to reach for me, the way the path could vanish without warning. I try to rationalize it, the disorientation, exhaustion, and darkness. But deep down, I know it wasn't all imagination. There's a part of the woods that is patient, that waits for hikers to lose their bearings, that reminds you, quietly, that the forest is older and far stranger than any map or trail sign could ever tell. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear it again, the soft hum, low and constant, as if the forest is still out there waiting. I picture the trail twisting and narrowing, the moss-covered rock marking the loop that wouldn't let me go, the shadows leaning closer in the dark, and a small, unavoidable dread settles in my chest, a reminder that the woods remember you, even after you've left, and sometimes they never let go. I arrived at Hollow Creek late in the afternoon, expecting the kind of solitude that had drawn me to these woods for years. The narrow dirt road leading in had been rough, littered with loose rocks and overhanging branches, and I was relieved when my truck finally ground to a stop near the familiar clearing. The campsite was empty, the fire pits cold and abandoned, the surrounding forest thick and quiet except for the occasional drip of water from the pines. I felt that old comforting sense of isolation settle over me, the way it always did when I escaped the towns and the roads. Unpacking my gear, I noticed small things out of place, rocks stacked in odd, deliberate patterns, faint footprints circling the perimeter of the clearing, but none leading away. I shook my head and told myself it was just kids, local teenagers coming out here to fool around. That explanation made sense, and I let it settle in my mind, even as a small unease tickled at the edge of my awareness. I set up my tent near the far edge of the clearing, careful to keep it close to the tree line where the ground was flatter and firmer. The sun was slipping behind the ridges by then, turning the forest into a wash of dim, restless shadows. By the time I finished, the last light was fading, and the woods had taken on that strange, muted quality where every sound seemed slightly amplified and every movement exaggerated. A breeze whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wet earth and moss, but I noticed something strange. The rustling didn't feel like the wind. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the forest itself was breathing. Then it grew insistent, a deliberate pacing just beyond the tense mesh. I froze, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a fox, but the steps were too measured, too steady. I unzipped a corner of the tent, squinting into the dimness. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the clearing, twisted and elongated by the faint glow of twilight, but I couldn't see anyone. I waited, watching, heart hammering. The rustling became a slow, deliberate knocking against one of the trees near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight, a persistence that made my chest tighten. I tried to rationalize it, whispering to myself that I was imagining things, that I was on edge after the long drive and hike, but the rhythm of the knocking didn't stop. My thoughts kept racing, circling the possibilities, each more implausible than the last, yet none felt right. The forest had grown quiet around me again, but the knocking continued, patient and precise. I lay awake for hours, listening, trying to make sense of the sound. Every now and then it would stop, only to start again moments later, closer to the tent or just beyond my field of vision. I dared not move, afraid that any motion would draw attention, though I wasn't sure to what. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet pine and moss, but also a faint, almost metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I thought about hiking back down before dark, but the thought of moving through the trees while whatever was out there prowled the clearing froze me in place. Exhaustion finally claimed me, but only in fitful, shallow bursts of sleep, each interrupted by a rustle or a snap that jolted me awake. Morning came in pale, diffuse light that seeped through the dense canopy. When I stepped out of the tent, the forest looked calm, almost cheerful in its quiet way, as though nothing had happened at all. I glanced around the clearing and noticed the footprints were gone, the rocks stacked in intricate patterns now reduced to simple piles, the fire pits as cold and empty as before. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried with it the sense that Hollow Creek itself had been aware of me, had observed my every move through the night. I packed my things quickly, heart still racing, and left without looking back. Even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, that the forest had marked me in some small, indelible way. Days later, I found myself replaying the sounds of that night, the deliberate knocking, the pacing just beyond the tent, the shadows that seemed to bend toward me. I could almost hear the low hum of the creek, distorted by memory, carrying the weight of those hours when I had been so alone. Hollow Creek seemed to linger in my mind, a quiet, persistent presence, reminding me that the woods never truly forget. I returned to the mountains eventually, but never to that clearing. I stick to the trails now, avoiding the areas that feel too empty, too isolated. Yet sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear it, the faint, deliberate tapping, the echo of footsteps in the underbrush that aren't there. I feel it in the rustle of leaves outside my window, in the shifting shadows cast by streetlights, a reminder that Hollow Creek and the night I spent there are always waiting somewhere just beyond perception, patient and unrelenting. Even writing about it now, the memory feels alive, pressing against me with that same quiet insistence. There is something in those woods that remembers, that watches, and it has left me with a lingering unease I cannot shake. I cannot explain it, nor can I convince myself that it was just imagination. Hollow Creek is out there, waiting, patient, and somehow aware. I think about it constantly, the weight of its silence pressing in even when I am far from those pines, and I know that the forest has left a mark on me that time cannot erase. I was hiking alone that evening, carrying a lantern to guide my way after dark, the kind of old-fashioned kerosene lantern that casts a warm, unsteady glow but barely reaches beyond a few feet. The ridge ahead looked familiar. I'd been here before, in daylight, following these same twists and bends, stopping to rest on mossy rocks, listening to the quiet hum of the forest. But as I rounded the first corner after sunset, the trail felt off. Every familiar landmark seemed slightly shifted, the trees standing in unfamiliar patterns, shadows stretched longer than they should, and the wind carried sounds that didn't belong. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the dim light playing tricks, the isolation warping my perception. Then I saw it, a figure in the distance, holding a lantern of its own. My first thought was relief. Someone else had found the trail, maybe another camper or hiker. I called out, voice rough from the dry air and the strain of the climb, but the figure didn't answer. It didn't move in the way I expected, just shifted slightly among the trees, almost gliding, its light swaying in a way that didn't match the rhythm of someone walking. My heart caught in my chest. When I took a cautious step forward, the figure vanished, leaving only the glow of the lantern suspended on the path ahead. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and it was still there, flickering just out of reach. Fear began to claw at my chest, the cold air sharpening the unease that had been creeping in since I'd left the last clearing. I followed, lantern held high, each step careful, deliberate. Every time I gained on the glow, it drifted farther, as if the ridge itself were moving it just beyond my reach. I tried to call again, but the sound of my own voice felt swallowed by the forest. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying whispers that sounded almost like distant laughter, faint and impossible to place. I wondered if I was imagining it, but the light's movement was deliberate, and my muscles tensed with a fear I couldn't shake. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, It was impossible to tell in that dim, wavering glow. The lantern seemed to guide me deeper into the trees, past bends I didn't recognize, past rocks and roots that looked familiar by shape but not by placement. The forest felt alive, pressing closer with every step, and the soft brush of leaves against my arms felt too intentional to be random. My chest burned with exertion, but I couldn't stop watching the light. There was a pull to it, like it was showing me something, though I had no idea what. The darkness beyond the lantern's halo deepened, a solid black that pressed at my sight and my senses, making every movement of the trees feel predatory. At some point, the lantern in my hand began to flicker more violently, sputtering against the cold, damp air. I reached to adjust it, but the flame went out entirely, leaving me in darkness that seemed to pulse with the memory of the drifting light. Panic surged. The trail behind me had become obscured, branches and roots forming shapes that could have been familiar in daylight but were alien in shadow. I stumbled, cursing under my breath, fumbling for a direction, trying to find a landmark I could recognize, but the ridge had changed. The memory of the lantern, its steady guiding sway, remained in my mind, hovering at the edges of perception like a ghost I couldn't follow or touch. I sat down on a fallen log, breathing hard, trying to regain some sense of control. The forest was quiet now, the wind stilled, the shadows deep and unmoving, but the fear hadn't left. My ears strained for the faintest sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant calling of an animal, but there was only a heavy, unnatural silence. I realized then that I was entirely alone, and yet I could still feel the presence of that light, guiding, watching, shaping my path without ever showing itself fully. The sensation made my stomach twist, the kind of dread that sits low, pressing into your chest and lungs, making every small noise echo like a threat. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and push forward, hands brushing along tree trunks to keep from tripping, feet finding roots and stones by memory and touch. My lantern remained dead, and I navigated the ridge in silence, relying on instincts honed by years of hiking, but the trail seemed unfamiliar at every turn. Every bend brought new shadows that looked like shapes I'd known, and every slope seemed steeper than it should. The forest had taken on a strange, predatory rhythm, the way it always feels when the night is deep and empty, and I kept expecting the light to reappear, to beckon me further, but it never did. By the time the first hints of dawn began to touch the sky, I had stumbled onto a section of the trail that I recognized. The slope of the ridge, the pattern of roots, the mossy rocks, but the unease never left. The memory of that drifting lantern lingered, haunting the edges of my vision, appearing in the shadow of a branch, the curve of a root, the way the morning light slanted across the trees. Even hours later, I could feel it at the edges of awareness, a presence that had guided me through the night without ever showing itself, leaving me with a hollow, persistent fear that I couldn't explain. I've avoided that ridge since, sticking to the daylight and to trails where I can see every bend and landmark clearly. But at night, when the wind stirs the pines or the lamplight flickers in my own home, I see it again, the memory of the lantern swaying just out of reach, guiding me deeper into shadows I thought I knew but that have never truly been familiar. The ridge hasn't forgotten me, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. I wasn't planning to stop that day. I'd been hiking since morning, following a long-forgotten service trail that wound deep through the Appalachian backwoods, the kind of route that had been carved decades ago for logging trucks and then left to rot when the land was abandoned. The trees had grown thick around it, swallowing the path in roots and brush, and the air carried that still, untouched quiet you only get in places people haven't bothered with in a long time. I remember thinking I'd turn around before dusk, maybe camp closer to a familiar ridge, but then I found the clearing, an old campsite, forgotten by everyone but the forest. At first I thought it was just debris, fallen branches, broken limbs, scraps of nature scattered across the ground. But as I stepped closer, I saw the remnants of tarps draped over what used to be makeshift shelters. The fabric was sun-bleached and rotting, sagging like skin left too long in a rain. Rotted supplies lay in piles across the clearing. Rusted cans, torn backpacks, a cooler half buried in mud. Everything felt paused, like people had been there only days before, not years. The air carried a heaviness that didn't sit right, thick and stagnant, almost warmer than the cool breeze brushing the ridge. I called out, more out of habit than expectation. My voice sounded small against the trees, swallowed faster than normal, like the forest didn't want to carry it. No answer came, but I felt watched, an unmistakable tension, a prickling down my arms, like a pair of unseen eyes were tracking every move I made. I told myself it was just the atmosphere of the place, the decay and the loneliness of it, but that explanation didn't settle the unease building in my chest. Something about the clearing felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just observed. I decided I'd only stay long enough to refill my water and get my bearings. But the trail behind me had narrowed to the point where turning back felt useless, and the trail ahead had grown too faint to trust in the quickly dimming light. I figured one night wouldn't hurt, and the clearing, for all its strangeness, offered a flat place to set up. So I pitched my tent a little ways off from the old campsite, far enough that I wouldn't have to stare at those shredded tarps while I tried to sleep, but close enough that I could keep an eye on it. Dusk settled fast, swallowing the last light between the pines. I lit a small fire, nothing big, just enough to keep the cold away, and sat with my back to a fallen log, listening to the forest breathe. For a while, everything was quiet, just the normal nighttime sounds. Wind moving through the branches, the crackle of fire, a distant owl somewhere deep in the trees. I almost managed to relax. Almost. Then I heard it, my voice. It came from the old campsite, faint at first, like a distant replay of something I'd said hours earlier. Just a few words, muffled, almost swallowed by the darkness. I froze, staring at the silhouettes of the rotted shelters. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. No rustling. No branches snapping. Just that thick, heavy silence again. I tried to shake it off, told myself the wind can play tricks when the air sits strange in the hollows, but the unease returned, sharper than before, sinking deep under my skin. After a while, I unzipped my tent and stepped out, lantern in hand. I shined the light toward the campsite. The shadows bent around the beams, crawling along the collapsed tarps like they were alive. I called out again, louder, half trying to provoke whoever, or whatever, was mimicking me. Hello? Anyone out there? The reply came instantly. But it wasn't my voice. Not exactly. It was twisted, fragile, stretched thin like something had dragged my words across gravel. The tone was pleading, almost desperate, and the sound of it made my stomach knot. It came from the campsite, from the dead center of that clearing. I raised the lantern higher, expecting to catch movement, a figure, an animal, anything. But there was nothing. No one. Just scraps of forgotten camp gear lying motionless in the dirt. My heart started pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I backed toward my tent slowly, trying not to look away from the campsite for even a second. The forest seemed to close in tighter around the clearing, the trees leaning inward, trapping the sound between their trunks. Every gust of wind came back distorted, like the branches themselves were trying to shape words, to mimic the sounds I made. Inside the tent, the echoes only grew stronger. Every time I shifted or breathed too loudly, something outside answered. Not with perfect mimicry, never that. The echoes were warped, broken, like they carried the weight of something ancient lodged deep beneath the soil. At one point, I whispered to myself, I just need to make it until morning. A beat later, the clearing whispered back. But it didn't speak the words. It spoke the fear behind them. The reply was a trembling, anguished sound, like someone trying to call for help but failing, choking on the attempt. The wind pressed against the tent walls then, hard enough to rattle the poles, and I pressed myself flat against my sleeping bag, trying not to make a single noise. My own heartbeat felt too loud, like it would trigger another response. Hours passed in a blur of half-conscious terror. Every shift of the ground, every sigh of the trees, every creak of fabric echoed back to me in some twisted form. Footsteps, soft and uneven, circled the tent more than once, though I never saw a shadow, never heard breathing, never caught a silhouette against the nylon. Only those broken echoes, repeating pieces of sound that didn't belong to anything alive. When the first weak light of dawn slipped through the canopy, I unzipped the tent without packing anything. My legs felt numb, my throat tight, but I forced myself to look toward the campsite. The tarps looked untouched, exactly as before. The rotted supplies sat in the same shape, the same angle. But the ground around them was different. The dirt was disturbed. Tracks, impressions, drag marks. Too many to count. too many shapes to make sense of. I didn't stay to investigate. I just slung my bag over my shoulder and pushed into the woods, following the faintest trail I could find. 4 hours, the echoes followed me. Not loud, not close, but always there, just behind the trees or across the creek beds. They carried with them a sorrow I couldn't explain, like they weren't chasing me but begging me not to leave. Even now, when the wind moves just right or my footsteps hit a hollow patch of ground, I hear it again, that thin, pleading echo, calling my voice back to me with something broken underneath it. I don't know what happened in that abandoned camp, but whatever those people left behind, it's still there, still listening, still trying to speak. I had camped alone plenty of times before, tucked away in the deeper parts of the Appalachians where the forest grows thick enough to swallow sound. I always found comfort in that kind of isolation, being miles from the nearest road, the canopy locking out everything but the faint glow of the sky, the world reduced to the crackle of a fire and the steady pulse of the woods. That night felt no different at first. I found a small clearing between a tangle of hemlocks and poplar, flat enough for my tent and far from any of the worn footpaths locals mentioned. I wanted to be alone, and I was sure I had it. The quiet was heavy, the kind that doesn't drift away. It stays, settles around you like a second skin. I cooked a small meal, listened to the forest shift into night, and thought about turning in early. The moon was bright enough that its glow filtered between the pines in thin silver lines, catching the fog rolling low over the ground. I remember sitting there, feeling strangely peaceful, until I caught a movement just behind the tent. Not fast, not sudden, just there. A shadow that didn't belong to the trees. I froze, letting my eyes adjust. At first, I thought it was a stray deer stepping through the brush, but the shape wasn't right. Too tall, too narrow, and it didn't move with the hesitance of an animal. It stood perfectly still, like it had been there long before I noticed it, like it was waiting for me to finally look its way. I didn't call out. I didn't grab my knife. I just stopped breathing and watched. For a long time, nothing changed. The figure didn't shift or sway with the breeze. It didn't step closer or retreat. It held its place just beyond the fringe of my firelight, barely outside the space where shadows had edges. When I blinked, I half expected it to vanish like a trick of the eyes, but it stayed, too solid, too deliberate to dismiss. Eventually, I retreated into the tent. It felt childish, ducking inside thin nylon like it offered any real protection, but I couldn't stand the sensation of that unseen stare burning into me. I left the lantern off. Light felt like an invitation. I lay there in the dark, listening to my heartbeat thud against the fabric. For a while, there was only silence. Long enough that I started convincing myself I'd imagined it, that the moon had played tricks on me, or the fog had warped the shape of a fallen branch. Then I heard it. A soft press of weight on the pine needles. Slow, deliberate steps circling the tent. Not heavy enough to be a bear, not light enough to be anything smaller. Human footsteps. Careful ones. They stopped just inches behind my head, on the far side of the tent wall. I held my breath. The silence stretched tight, thin as thread. I thought if I exhaled too loudly, whatever stood there would lean in, press its face against the nylon, whisper something I could never forget. But it didn't. It just stood there, listening, matching my stillness with its own. At some point I must have drifted in and out of a half-sleep, those frightening moments when you're conscious but too paralyzed to move. Every time I shifted, even slightly, I felt the presence shift with me. Not footsteps this time, just a pressure in the air like someone leaning close enough for their breath to disturb the fabric without making a sound. A mirror to every small motion I made. The hours crawled until faint light began bleeding through the tent seams. Morning. I waited longer than I needed to before unzipping the door. My hands shook so badly I fumbled with the zipper. When I finally stepped outside, the clearing looked untouched at first glance. The trees were still. The fog had settled. No figure. No movement. But the ground behind the tent told the truth. Footprints, clear ones, pressed into the soil. Not mine. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Long, narrow, each toe distinct in the morning dew. They circled the tent twice before stopping at the rear, less than a foot from where my head had rested. The impressions were deep enough to show the weight of the person who'd stood there for what must have been hours. The woods were silent again, but not the peaceful kind of silence I'd felt the evening before. This was different. Watching silence. Expectant silence. I didn't eat. I didn't break down the fire pit. I barely rolled my tent before stuffing it haphazardly into my pack. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for that figure to reappear at the edge of the trees, standing there the same way it had before, tall, still, patient. When I finally started down the trail, my hands wouldn't stop trembling. All the way back to the main path, I felt a presence behind me. Not close enough to hear. Not close enough to see. But close enough to know it hadn't finished watching. That silent stranger from the clearing didn't follow me physically. I never heard another footstep, never saw another shadow that didn't belong, but the sense of it lingered like breath on the back of my neck. For weeks afterward, I saw movement in the corners of my vision when I walked past windows or looked into the tree line behind my house. Just a small sway, a shift, never enough to catch full on. But always there. Always waiting at the edge of sight. I don't know who or what stood behind my tent that night, but sometimes when I wake in the dark, I swear I feel the same quiet presence standing just beyond reach, mirroring my breath the way it did in the forest. And I have a feeling it remembers me just as clearly as I remember it.